Hi, my name is Eric Jensen. I'm presenting here on one of the studies that kind of underpins thinking about the role of social media in scientific misinformation and also the kind of impact of scientific information on social media. So this video is about a study that was done in 2019. The study was published in the journal Public Understanding of Science, and I'm going to walk through what the study looked at, how it looked at it, and what the findings were, and then talk about how that connects to the project Viral Communication, which is funded by the BMBF in Germany. So let's start with the kind of roadmap, the signposts along the way of where we're going with this presentation. So I'll start with a few comments about the so-called infodemic. This is the idea that there is a kind of science communication and public understanding of science challenge that's going alongside the kind of physical health challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. So then I'll get into the details of this particular study that I'm talking about in this video and look at the issues that it looked at, and then we'll think about how this applies to the COVID-19 context, and in particular how it connects up to a study that we're running called Viral Communication. And you can see more about that study at viralcomm.info. So the COVID-19 Infodemic. This is a term that's been used by the Director General of the WHO to talk about the kind of public perception, public attitude, kind of challenge around communication around the pandemic and around what we should be doing to kind of make our way through this challenge. And there are a number of aspects of that infodemic, the kind of information and misinformation and disinformation challenges that are accompanying the pandemic. And this is a common pattern. We've seen this in past epidemics, past pandemics. But one of the factors that is more clear, more strong this time around is the role of social media in how people get information and how they use that to mobilize against mitigation behaviors, for example, or to on the positive side to share insights about the best ways to protect each other from getting the virus. So some of the key characteristics of this infodemic connect to this study, which was conducted before the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019. The study was published. And trust in science is one of the kind of core focus areas for this study. And then it's looking at the connection between online science communication, so how people get their news and the extent to which they access news through social media, and then how does that connect up with public trust in science. So this is aiming to get at the question of what do we know about how social media help, don't help on trust in science in general, but then this study looks at differences across different countries. So it looks at 20 different countries and takes a kind of comparative perspective to analyze the role of culture in this dynamic, the dynamic between social media and science communication on social media, and then trust in science as an outcome measure. So this study was conducted, as I mentioned, in the period before the pandemic. It was published in 2019 in the journal Public Understanding of Science, which is one of the top science communication journals. And you can see here the author list. The lead author is Huber. So this study, which as you can see, it has co-authors from different parts of the world, and indeed it was conducted across 20 countries and then analyzed statistically. So we're going to start with the kind of the context for the study and some of the kind of starting perspectives and assumptions and kind of things that were already known in existing literature which were then used to kind of underpin the specific study here. So in general, one of the things that's already known about some of the kind of potential negative effects on public trust in science that can be associated with social media as a source of science news. One of them that is kind of has been widely discussed for a long time is the lack of quality control. So one of the distinctive features of a kind of legacy media, and certainly historically, it's actually less and less the case due to budget cuts and actually due to the rise of social media and other online news sources where the revenues that news agencies get is not as much. So that has resulted in news agencies having to cut back on their quality control processes and their ability to do their own kind of investigative work. But there is still a clear distinction between kind of high-end legacy media, which do invest in quality control measures, and they do have some pathways to accountability, compared to just information that circulates on social media. So it's a lot easier to get the spread of scientific misinformation on social media because of this lack of quality control. Now, on the kind of boosters for public trust in science that have been associated with social media, one of them is that social media can be used to correct misinformation. So you see scientifically inaccurate information being communicated in a public forum, and therefore there's potential to go in and respond and correct. You have more visibility that people have this misinformation, and you have a chance to help them to correct it. You can link to credible sources, that kind of thing, in order to kind of arrive at the correct information. And there has been some research supporting this idea that there is a kind of self-correcting function that exists in social media sometimes, where misinformation gets corrected by other well-meaning members of the online community. So that's one thing. And then the other is the potential to access wider information networks. You can have direct access to scientists, for example, that are at the cutting edge of an issue. If we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people have followed directly scientists who have done podcasts, virologists doing podcasts, or you follow their Twitter feed or whatever. There's this possibility to access perspectives that would not have been possible without social media. And then there's the potential for greater engagement. So opportunities to discuss issues, to talk about how they connect to your life. So this can kind of make science news less abstract and distant. Okay, let's go further into the question of what is trust in science and what do we know about it already? So first, we think about trust. What is trust? And here's a definition. It's the probability that someone will perform an action that is beneficial or at least not detrimental to us is high enough for us to consider engaging in some form of cooperation with them. So basically, trust is about the relationships that we have and about whether we're willing to cooperate and accept what somebody else tells us, especially what they tell us they will be doing to or for us. So that's trust in general. It applies to trust in science. But one of the kind of special features of trust in science as a concept is that science is not one thing. It's not a monolith. There are many different kinds and sizes and levels of prestige of scientific institutions. There are many different kinds of scientists, so scientists in different fields. So whether you trust in science might depend on which kind of scientists that you imagine, whether you think about institutions like a university, or whether you think about individual scientists, whether you think about a celebrity scientist, or what do you think about the scientific method? When somebody says, I trust in science, do they mean I trust in the scientific method, using observation and evidence as the basis for developing knowledge? So there's a little bit of uncertainty about what trust in science means for any one individual. but taken as an aggregate, it's a variable that that's very interesting. And one of the reasons that it's very interesting is that science features in political decision making. This is something that we're seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the role of science in political decision making is very explicit, unusually explicit, because politicians are explicitly saying that their approach is based on the science. This is a kind of statement about how a kind of action and policy develops that is not that common overall. Typically, the claim that policy making is based purely on science is not the kind of approach that's used under normal conditions. But in the condition of a pandemic, where trust in science and scientists is pretty high, and trust in politicians, at least some politicians, is not so high, this is quite a key issue. So when people see scientific information, how do they respond? Do they feel like science is something that they can have a role in? This is another reason why trust in science is important, because we live in an increasingly scientific and tech-oriented society, which is driven by science. And so it's important, the relationship that publics have to science is important, both at the political level and at the level of kind of their daily lives. Also, science is connected to public funding. A lot of science is funded by public money. And so public attitudes about science, whether the public trust that science will be beneficial for them, these are important questions. And so this is one of the reasons that trust in science is a kind of high priority variable, a kind of outcome that there's a lot of interest in. So some of the existing research on trust in science shows us some predictors that we already know about what's going to make someone more likely or less likely to trust in science. If you just do a kind of general cross-cutting survey, cross-sectional survey, and you look at where are there higher or lower trust in science, predictors of higher trust in science are education level, income level. So those with higher education, with more income, are more likely to trust in science. Same for scientific knowledge. So those that know more about science are more likely to trust in science. Those that are consuming media that don't have a right-wing bent to them, and those that read newspapers more and use the internet more. These are all predictors of higher trust in science. So these are correlations. And then the correlations, what are called negative correlations, so the things that are predictors of less trust in science, are watching TV a lot, so very heavy TV viewing, and consuming right-wing conservative news. So social media news consumption and trust in science, that's the kind of, the connection between these two things is the focus of Huber et al. 2019, the study we're looking at here. And there are good reasons to think that there would be a connection between these things. So social media use potentially increases exposure to scientific information because you have access to a more diversified and extensive network for information. There's the potential for social recommendation. So for people to say through social media, this is true, or this is something that shows we can or cannot trust science. So there's more potential for kind of interpersonal impact via social media. And then you have this potential for direct interaction between scientists and the public, which is relatively rare. It happens in certain contexts like science festivals, open days, this kind of thing. But most people, most of the time, don't have the kind of direct access to scientists on a day-to-day basis that they could have through social media. So each of these are potential reasons why it's worth looking at this connection between social media consumption and science, because these give us a sense that there might be something there. And so these points connect to the first hypothesis explored in this paper, which is that social media consumption will be positively related to trust in science. In other words, there'll be a positive correlation that as social media news use, news consumption goes up, trust in science also goes up. So one thing that's a kind of unique feature of this study and why the study offers some kind of added value is that it looks at international comparisons. So you can see in the study the point that online news consumption, just like news consumption in general and audiences in general, is not the same cross-culturally, and this study does not assume that it's the same cross-culturally. So it brings to bear some existing, an existing model about cross-cultural differences. It's a model coming out of psychology to look at whether and how there might be effects between different cultural contexts and cultural norms in general, and this relationship that's being explored in the study between social media use on the one hand and trust in science on the other hand. So while Hofstede has 6 different dimensions that are mentioned in the study, the focus in this study is 2 particular dimensions for cross-cultural difference that they think might be relevant to social media. So the first is individualism to collectivism spectrum. So this is the first variable. The second is power distance index. So I'll explain these 2 variables that are used to understand cross-cultural differences and how those cross-cultural differences might affect the connection between social media news consumption on the one hand and trust in science on the other. So the first part of the first variable, individualism versus collectivism, this is the degree to which people are integrated into social groups and networks. So this is things like how important is it to you that your group, your family, your community, that they see you in a positive light and that you kind of conform with their expectations. So in some countries that's really, really important. In other countries, it's really not, and then there's a whole spectrum in between. And so that's what this variable of individualism to collectivism gets at. The next dimension that they use, the second one, is the power distance index. And this is the extent to which low power members of society, so if you imagine the poor and the disenfranchised in society, the extent to which they accept that it's okay, that it's okay and normal that power is distributed unequally. So are people accepting inequality in society that are at the bottom, or are they wanting to resist and they see it as something illegitimate that there are these kind of stark inequalities in their societies? So this is called power distance index, or PDI. Okay, so basically, I mentioned the first hypothesis already that the study is testing, but they're also setting up some hypotheses around these variables of individualism to collectivism and power distance index. So some of the reasons they give, so they're kind of citing existing research that gives them reason to take a particular position in terms of their hypotheses that they then test in the empirical study. So because of the prior research, they think that it's possible that because collectivist cultures put a higher importance on the perspectives of others, this could make social media more powerful in collectivist cultures. Also, because of this kind of placing, kind of more importance on the views of others in their community or in their families, that this could mean that social media could have a stronger effect on their opinions. So that's the kind of direction for collectivism versus individualism and how there might be impact in different ways there. And then there's the high power distance index countries. So the countries where those who are at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder accept social inequality as something that is okay, normal, etc. So in those contexts, there's more acceptance of authority, and there is an more interest in having guidance from superiors, kind of giving them the direction that they should be going. And so this also feeds into the hypothesis around power distance index. So I'm now going to go through each of the hypotheses one at a time, and you'll see how this kind of background information feeds into the hypotheses that they're testing in the study. So the first hypothesis I mentioned already, and that's the idea that social media news consumption will be positively correlated to trust in science. So as social media news consumption goes up, trust in science also goes up. That's hypothesis one. So this is something they're testing in the study. Hypothesis two is that this positive correlation that they think there will be between social media news consumption and trust in science will be stronger in collectivist countries than in individualist countries, for the reasons I mentioned previously in terms of research about how people operate and perceive the views of others in collectivist cultures on a relative basis. Now, none of these concepts are absolute. The idea of individualism and collectivism is a spectrum. It's a spectrum that exists both within countries and between countries. So there's no kind of argument being made that every person in an aggregate overall collectivist culture is going to have these collectivist views. There will always be a range within countries and across countries. Then hypothesis three is that positive correlation between social media news consumption and trust in science that's been claimed in hypothesis one, that will be stronger in high power distance index countries than in low power distance index countries. And the fourth hypothesis is one that focuses on the combination of collectivism or individualism and high power distance index. So the claim is that there will be less active information seeking and more of a priority on others in the combination of these two. So in countries where they are both collectivist, high collectivism, where they care very much about the views and perspectives of others in their social groups, that has a high influence on them. And then also if you combine that with the countries that are both collectivist and have a high acceptance of social inequality in their countries, amongst those who are on the bottom end of the ladder, that you'll see these kinds of connections. So this leads into hypothesis four, which is that the positive correlation between social media news consumption and trust in science will be stronger in collectivist countries that have high power distance when compared to those in individualist countries with low power distance. So this is looking at the combination of these two dimensions of cultural differences across countries. So this study is, as I've mentioned, looking at 20 countries, a very large sample, more than 21,000 respondents. And the way that they have kind of put these concepts into practice is that there's the kind of outcome variable of trust in science. This is the kind of core, most important outcome that they're prioritizing in this study. And here the measurement is on a range between no trust in science to a great deal of trust in science. And they found in their sample a mean that was basically in the middle and a standard deviation of 1.4. So, and then there's the news consumption level, and this ranges from never consuming news on social media to consuming news on social media all the time. And they found a mean, again, right about in the middle at 3.3. and with a fairly large standard deviation of 1.51. Then they used, at the country level, kind of existing measures for where these countries stand on individualism to collectivism spectrum and on the power distance index. So they used this information in order to come up with their findings. And they used one sample t-tests to look at trust in science and whether there are differences in trust in science, and indeed there were some differences in trust in science, with countries like Germany, UK, Russia, and China being right in the middle, around the mean, and then trust in science being higher in countries like Estonia, Argentina, and Spain, and lower in countries like Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. So then they started to investigate their hypotheses. So they're doing that with statistical analyses, and here I'll run through the findings from each of the hypotheses. So on hypothesis 1, which was that social media news consumption would be positively correlated with trust in science. So as social media news consumption went up, trust in science also goes up. That was the hypothesis, and they found that that was the case. That's true. But the kind of strength of the correlation varies across countries. So it's not a kind of stable picture in terms of how strong that correlation is. There is variation in what's called the effect size between countries on this correlation. Hypothesis 2 was that the positive relationship, the positive correlation between social media news consumption and trust in science would be different in collectivist countries. In particular, the hypothesis was that it would be stronger in collectivist countries, and that was not confirmed by the study. There was no difference between the collectivist and the individualist countries on the pure strength of the relationship between news consumption on social media and trust in science. The hypothesis 3 was looking at the relationship between trust in science and social media use and whether it was mediated by power distance index as a variable. So was it different in countries with high or low power distance index? And here the finding was that indeed there is a stronger relationship. So the magnitude of the correlation between social media news consumption and trust in science is higher in high power distance index countries than in low power distance index countries. And hypothesis 4 was also confirmed. And this, as you'll recall, is the idea that positive correlation between social media news consumption and trust in science is relatively stronger in collectivist countries with a high power distance index. This is the one that looks at the combination of these factors. And the finding was, indeed, there was a statistically significant pattern where the strength of the correlation was more, the magnitude, the effect size was greater in collectivist countries that have a high power distance index. So this combination of factors between these two dimensions is what revealed the pattern. And one of the predictors of higher or lower strength of association between social media news consumption and trust in science. So let's now think about what are the implications. What does this mean in terms of our analysis in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? So remember, this was a study that was conducted and published in 2019 before the pandemic. What does it tell us? So one of the points is that there is indeed a positive correlation where as social media news consumption goes up, trust in science also goes up. And that's a kind of overall pattern. But then there's variation between countries in how strong that correlation is. So in some cases, much stronger or weaker than others in different countries. And we also see the finding that social media news consumption, when you compare it to consumption of traditional news consumption, like legacy media news consumption, you see a stronger relationship between social media news consumption and trust in science than between legacy media consumption and trust in science. So some of the limitations of the study, one of the obvious ones, because this is a cross-sectional survey-based study, there is limitations in terms of causal claims that can be made. Because it's a snapshot, it's a point in time, so we can say that there's a correlation based on these findings, but the causal mechanisms, what is actually driving these outcomes, is less clear because it's cross-sectional as a study, meaning one point in time, as opposed to longitudinal tracking change over time. So that's one of the key limitations, and it means that we can kind of make some guesses about what the causal mechanisms might be, but we don't have strong evidence about that because it's basically a correlation study. The other is that the focus here was only about quantity of exposure to social media news and not about the specifics of what is in that social media news. So what exactly are people consuming? What is the quality and the nature of that news consumption? This is not looked at in this study because they've only looked at overall exposure and quantity alone. So that is one of the key areas that still needs to be addressed, is what does specific differences in kinds of content in social media news, what impact does that have in terms of trust in science and other variables? So what we can conclude from this study is that culture is an important factor. So we are able to see in this study they found cultural differences on a number of grounds, but in particular on the relationship between exposure to news and social media, so consumption of social media news, and trust in science. They found that that was mediated by a combination of collectivism and power distance index, that if we know those two things together, we can predict some of the variance in differences in terms of the power of social media news consumption as a driver of trust in science or distrust in science. And we can see that there is this kind of pattern where different countries have different kind of starting points for trust in science. They have different kind of patterns. And so there's a lot more to be discovered about the specifics of how this works and how differences between countries work in terms of the relationship between attitudes about science, trust in science, and social media news consumption. So now let's think about the context of the project Viral Communication, Public Responses to the COVID-19 Pandemic. So in this study is designed to address some of the limitations that I just mentioned. So in particular, the study will be looking at content of social media news and the information that people access through social media. It will also be longitudinal in terms of tracking outcomes. It'll be tracking outcomes that are a much wider range of outcomes, so not only trust in science measured in a simple self-report, but other factors like attitudes about science, sources of information, who do you trust for scientific information, so a wider range of outcome measures. And then it'll be feasible to connect the findings in terms of content of social media with the outcomes and the impacts of that social media because of the longitudinal design, which means we can track impact over time. And there will also be follow-up interviews to make sure that the survey is accurately uncovering people's views and that we're able to get deeper into the question of what are the causal mechanisms at play here. So statistical analysis of survey data on outcomes connected to observation of social media content gets us a long way. But then if we supplement that with qualitative interviews that can dig deeper in to the patterns of what's going on, then we can really start to get a clearer picture of what are the specific causal mechanisms at work here in this dynamic between social media, scientific information, and public responses and attitudes, including trust in science.